All right, hello everyone. I'm Thomas. Welcome to my channel. It's primarily an educational channel, and today we are doing our 98th video on the reciprocal system of theory. And this was discovered and refined by Mr. Dewey B. Larson back in the 20th century. He died back in 1990. And he had his first intuitions about all of this about 1930, developed the theory over about 20, 25 years through induction, and then came out with his fundamental postulates. And the gist of it is that in Larson's universe, the universe is not made out of matter, and it's not made out of energy, but it is made out of motion. And motion is the relationship between space and time. Space and time are reciprocals of each other, meaning that they are basically inversions of one another. The same way that 3/2 and 2/3 are reciprocals of one another. And therefore, they have the same qualities. Space is multidimensional, 3 or more dimensions, and so is time. Time has got 3 or more dimensions. And time is always flowing and progressing. It's always getting later and later. And therefore, too, space is always flowing and progressing, and things are always getting farther and farther apart. Observed by the Hubble telescope in the recession of the distant galaxies. And so then space and time are also quantized, meaning that there is a they only come in discrete units. There is a minimum unit of time and a minimum unit of space. There's no fractional units. There's no continuity there. It's all chunks, little chunks of space and time. Although it's not seen that way because space and time are only in motion. So they only appear together. You don't see, space by itself or time by itself. They are always, accompanying each other. And, but 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time is the speed of light. The speed of light in Larson's universe of motion is the null point or the neutral point, the midpoint, the origin of Larson's universe. Unlike Einstein, who says that the speed of light is the max speed of the universe, the speed of light is the midpoint. So there is an entire half of the universe that's moving faster than the speed of light. And then there is, Larson calls that the cosmic sector, or sector 2. And then there's half of the universe that we're familiar with that's moving slower than the speed of light. Larson calls that the material universe, or sector 1. And this is the universe of atoms and molecules, and of matter, material atoms and molecules. And because over on the cosmic side, there are cosmic atoms and molecules. And that's an important part of the reciprocal system. What goes on in sector 1 is also going on in sector 2, except that you have to invert the time-space relationships. So over here, you basically have space over time relationships, and over here, you basically have time over space relationships. But over here in sector 1, you have your the common chemistry and physics that we're familiar with, and things grow by bonding, aggregation, up until their most complex level, which Larson refers to as DNA. A DNA molecule has several billion atoms, and at that point, it becomes eligible to be taken control of by a sector 2 entity. And the combination in the right proportion, at the right configuration of a material and cosmic entities are what Larson calls the life unit. So life is a combination of a material and cosmic sector thing, like manifesting over here in sector 1. And then that life unit, which is controlled by a sector 2 entity in the same way that a thermostat controls a room, that sector 2 entity is just a tiny part of that life unit, but it controls it and it motivates it towards survival. And that sector 2 entity evolves and develops over time from the single-celled organisms like the amoebas and so on, all the way up to the most complex level, which is according to Larson, the intelligent human being. And this intelligent human being at that point becomes eligible to be taken control over again by a sector 3 entity. Now, sector 3 is, in my view, pointing at that midpoint there, the speed of light boundary, the origin. This is what Larson calls the metaphysical region, or sector 3, the area outside or beyond space and time. And other people would usually call this the numinous, or the religious, or God, or goddess, or gods. And it has to do with, it controls and it motivates toward ethical behavior, or good behavior, just behavior, right behavior. And sometimes sector 3 is in competition or conflict with sector 2. In many cases, they work the same. They work in harmony with one another. But there are situations where our motivation toward good behavior is in cross purposes with our motivation toward survival. And at that point, the human being is kind of caught in the middle and needs to make a decision, which is like a free will decision. Now, the free will, the sector 3 component communicates with humans, intelligent humans, in many different ways, but they're all really the same. They're all sector 3 communications. Depending on their complexity and their form. You have your ESP, intuition, religious revelation, scientific insight, beatific visions, probably a few others. These are all communications from sector 3. And these communications are all correct and are all pointing us toward ethical behavior. But our ability to translate those messages and understand those messages is severely limited. We have to look at ourselves as kind of like single-celled spiritual organisms, in the same way that an amoeba or whatever is a single-celled life organism. We're just getting started on our path, on our spiritual path. And so as a result, we're not able to understand these communications that well. Those of us who have prepared, who have studied, who have gotten ready and tried to learn how to translate these messages are, have a better chance. And some of the messages are simpler than others, depending on what kind of messages you're getting. If you're looking for religious revelations or scientific insight, the level of preparation that is necessary is pretty high. The bar is pretty high to be able to understand those messages. Simple everyday intuitions have a much more universal understanding. Okay, now what we're doing here with Larson is we're looking at his final book that came out after he died in 1995, called Beyond Space and Time. And so, as you might guess, this has to do with this Sector 3, or this metaphysical region. This is his only book that goes into metaphysics, into philosophy, religion, and psychology. Most of his earlier books have to do with chemistry and physics and astronomy. And we are in the middle of chapter 24, and this is called East and West. And this has to do with kind of contrasting between the Eastern and Western approaches to Sector 3 contact, and how because prior to this, he hadn't really delved into the characteristics of Sector 3. He just talked about it as good and good behavior, and that it has divine qualities, but doesn't really go into what those qualities are and what the ramifications are. So he just got done talking about how Eastern religions in general have a cyclical view of the universe, whereas the Western religions are more of a linear view. And he says that Eastern religions, the ultimate reality, the cyclical view of the ultimate reality that is common to Eastern religions is correct as far as it goes. Thus, the revelations, Sector 3 communications, from which this view was derived were, in this respect, authentic. Now we're going to get into the Western. Meanwhile, the Western religions, this is Larson, by the application of reason to the information derived from their authentic revelations, together with that derived from experience, have extended their view of religious reality into the metaphysical region. On the basis of this broader viewpoint, they have arrived at an interpretation of the religious aspect of human life as a one-way progression toward higher levels that are independent of the physical universe. This, too, is in agreement with the findings of the preceding pages. The apparent disagreement between East and West is due to the fact that each is concentrating its attention on a different part of existence as a whole. By rejecting, or at least minimizing, abstract theoretical inquiry into religious subjects, the people of the Orient have restricted the scope of their religious understanding in much the same way that they have, until very recently, limited the extent of their advances in scientific and other fields. On the other hand, the people of the West have been, to some extent, carried away by their enthusiasm over the discovery of the transcendent reality, and have tended to concentrate their attention on the hereafter at the expense of the religious aspects of the here and now. A self-defeating policy, inasmuch as the only way by which sustained progress can be made toward the ultimate goal is through experience in dealing with the problems of earthly life. One of the significant results of the difference between the cyclical and linear concepts of human destiny is a strong contrast between the attitudes of the Eastern and Western religions toward the human condition. Western religious thought recognizes that the world is full of unpleasant and undesirable things, but nevertheless regards human life on the whole as a reasonably enjoyable experience. One of the primary human objectives, as seen from this standpoint, is to make this experience still more rewarding. Eastern religious thought, on the other hand, regards human life on the whole as difficult and disagreeable, and emphasizes the existence of widespread suffering. The first noble truth of Buddhism is the existence of suffering. The second of these noble truths is that the suffering is due to man's desires. The remaining two stress the repression of these desires as the way of release from suffering. Similarly, for the Hindu, the good is not to be gained by manipulating nature, altering society, or seeking pleasure for ourselves. There is no indication that the actual conditions of life for the ordinary individual during the time when the major religions were in the process of formation were significantly different in one part of the world than in another. But the linear view is inherently optimistic. The religions of the West have diluted this optimism to some extent by raising the specter of a final judgment. But even so, the individual has a certain amount of control over his ultimate destiny and can at least see some promise of a better future. The cyclical outlook, on the contrary, is inherently pessimistic. And he's quoting a Westerner talking about Eastern religions. To be endlessly bound to an endless wheel, to be ground upon the road of life not once or twice or 1,000 times, but repeatedly and forever, with all responsibility, fault, and error ceaselessly accumulating to one's discredit, is not a pleasant prospect. And back to Larson, with this kind of a prospect facing him, the most that a person can hope for is some kind of a release mechanism that will liberate him from the perpetual cycle. Such a release was the original goal of the major Eastern religions. The goal of life in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism is essentially the same. Moksha, liberation, is the ultimate objective for Hinduism and Jainism, and nirvana is the goal in Buddhism. The precise meanings of liberation vary among the different schools, but even among those within the framework of Buddhism and Hinduism, but the essential meaning of both moksha and nirvana is emancipation or liberation from turmoil and suffering and freedom from rebirth. That's actually a quote from Radhakrishnan. The only escape, back to Larson, the only escape route that is fully consistent with the cyclical theory of existence is extinction of the human personality, either by total annihilation or by absorption into some kind of a cosmic essence. And some of the Eastern beliefs, particularly the earlier ones, and those such as Hinayana Buddhism, that have maintained the earlier doctrines relatively unchanged, define their nirvana or moksha in terms that amount to or approximate annihilation. But this is not an attractive prospect, and as a result of the general desire for a more acceptable alternative, together with the influence of contact with the linear religions of the West, the earlier views of the human fate have been modified in most of the current versions of the Eastern religions. The nirvana of Mahayana Buddhism, for example, is described as a state of wonderful heavenly bliss. On the question of human destiny, then, the East-West test is inconclusive because of the basic difference between the linear and cyclic viewpoints. This question will be examined in more detail in a few chapters. This basic conceptual difference likewise accounts in large part for the wide discrepancies between the teachings of the different religions with respect to the existence of a deity and the nature thereof, where the existence is asserted. All of the major religions, except the earliest versions of Jainism and Buddhism, are theistic, at least in the sense that worship of something or someone is a religious requirement. But there is a bewildering diversity of views as to the number, the nature, and the powers of the deities. The tendency to deify the founder of the religion is very marked and extends even to those cases where the founder explicitly denied any such status. Like the theoretical development in this present work, the East-West test leaves all questions in this area unanswered. East and West agree that there is something in human life that is physically indestructible. It is also agreed that there is some kind of a relationship between this indestructible human characteristic and the inherently metaphysical existences. There is no consensus as to the nature and extent of that relationship, but the amount of agreement that does exist is sufficient to confirm the theoretical conclusion that there is a non-physical component of the human personality. All of the religions of the world, this is a quote, all of the religions of the world have the teaching that the spiritual life of the human individual continues beyond physical death. However, the various religions differ widely concerning the details in their picture of the future life, and even concerning the desirability of a future life. Okay, back to Larson. A similar lack of consensus is seen in the attitudes toward evil. Some religions see little evil in the world. Others regard it as inherent in physical and human existence and mainly beyond human power to modify. Still others regard evil as an antagonist against which religion must continually do battle. The concept of sin, which is closely related to evil in Christian thought, is not so correlated in most other religions. Neither Buddhism, which sees evil in all existence, nor Hinduism, which regards evil as illusory, concedes the existence of sin in the Christian sense. Thus, the Christian concept of the essential sinfulness of man and the need for some kind of an expiatory action, either by himself or by a surrogate, to achieve harmony with the higher existence gets no support from the East-West test. The same is true of the problem of evil that looms so large in the thinking of Western people. To many, says John Hick, the most powerful positive objection to belief in God is the fact of evil. But none of the Eastern religions accept the premises in terms of which this problem is stated in the West. Okay, that's it. Talk to you tomorrow.